The deposition you are reading was recorded at the Authority Deepwater Provisions Office, Station Kethvar, on the 41st day following the platform Hessek incident. I have been asked to give a full account of my time on the platform, my observations regarding the Drethkai pack, and the events of the salvage team's arrival. I will do that. I will try to be orderly about it. I was a hydrophone survey technician for 11 years before platform Hessek, and orderly is the only way I know how to do things. My name is Dara Moss. I am 47 years old. I hold a Class 2 Deepwater Acoustic Certification and a Compact Deepwater Survey License. Current. I was contracted by the Outer Shelf Survey Authority to extend the acoustic survey of the Hessek Formation Deep Shelf Corondal Basin. The survey had already burned through 2 rotations of technicians. I knew that when I signed anyway, because the acoustic data from both previous rotations was some of the strangest I had ever read, and I wanted to know what was making it. That is where I should start, I think. The data. The first rotation's hydrophone logs showed standard deep shelf ambient noise for about 3 weeks. Thermal layer shifts, subsurface current turbulence, the low-frequency groan of the platform structure settling. Normal then. Around day 22 of that rotation, the logs start showing something else. A recurring pattern in the 40 to 80 Hz range. Not geological, not current turbulence. Directed, rhythmic. Complex enough that the first rotation's senior technician flagged it as possible equipment interference, and spent the next 6 weeks trying to find the source in the hardware. He never found it because it was not in the hardware. The second rotation arrived, looked at the same anomaly, made the same wrong assumption, and added a note to their departure report. Persistent, low-frequency acoustic anomaly of unknown origin. Recommend hardware audit before next rotation. They also noted that 2 team members had refused to conduct dive lock maintenance after week 4 because of what they described as, and I am quoting the report here, large dark shapes visible at depth near platform skirt. The report recommended hazard assessment before next rotation. It recommended the use of deterrent charges if the shapes were confirmed as biological. I read both reports on the transit vessel going out. I read them twice. Then I put them away and started thinking about what kind of biological source would produce a directed, rhythmic, complex acoustic pattern in the 40 to 80 Hz range, targeted consistently at the same hydrophone array for a period of months. I had some ideas. The 40 to 80 Hz range is interesting territory. It sits below the threshold where most standard biological survey protocols are calibrated to flag anomalies. Most survey equipment is tuned for the 60 to 120 range, which catches the bulk of documented marine vocalization. Whatever was producing the signal had, by accident or design, found the dead band in standard survey methodology. Both previous rotations had their instruments set to default parameters. I had spent about 3 weeks before departure reviewing the raw data files, not the processed outputs, the raw hydrophone feeds, and I had seen what the processed outputs had smoothed away. The pattern was there. Complex, layered, and in my professional estimation, not geological and not equipment artifact. I had recalibrated my analysis software on the transit vessel before I arrived. I wanted to hear it in full when I got there. Platform Hessek sits on the lip of the Corondal Deep Shelf, where the sea floor drops from 200 meters to over 1,200 in the span of about 3 kilometers. It is not a pleasant piece of water. The platform itself is old, a decommissioned gas extraction rig that the survey authority repurposed about 9 years ago. It has a lower dive lock chamber, a submersible bay that fits 1 small survey vessel, 2 instrument decks, crew quarters for 8, and a surface platform skirt that extends about 4 meters out from the main structure at the waterline. The nearest inhabited station is about 6 hours by fast transit. It is very quiet. I liked it immediately. I arrived in the 3rd week of the 7th month of the standard year, which the calendar here will confirm was approximately 21 months before the incident that prompted this deposition. My rotation was initially contracted for 90 days. I want to be clear about that, because Director Verl's legal team has suggested in their filings that I had some kind of standing arrangement or claim on the platform that went beyond my contracted terms. I did not. I had a 90-day contract which was extended 3 times, and each extension was approved in writing by the survey authority. I have copies of all 3 extensions. I provided them to this office on day 2 of this process. In any case, I arrived. I ran a full hardware audit of the hydrophone array in the first 4 days, because that is what you do when you inherit 2 rotations worth of unexplained data. The hardware was fine. The array was functioning exactly as it should. The anomaly in the 40 to 80 Hz range showed up on my second night on the platform, right on schedule, and I put my headset on and I listened. It was not equipment interference. I am going to try to describe what it sounded like, and I want to be precise because precision matters here. It was not a single tone. It was a layered pattern, multiple frequencies occurring simultaneously, some sustained, some pulsed, with a rhythm that shifted in ways that seemed to respond to changes in the background acoustic environment. When a large current pulse came through, the pattern adjusted its timing. When the platform structure creaked, there was a brief pause in the pattern, and then it resumed, slightly altered. It was, and as I say this as a certified acoustic survey technician, with 11 years of experience reading hydrophone data, communicative in character. I do not mean that as a casual observation. I mean that it showed the structural hallmarks of intentional communication, directed transmission, responsive adjustment, repetition with variation. I made a note in my survey log, anomaly confirmed biological. Source likely large pelagic organism or organisms. Behavior suggests acoustic targeting of array. Recommend extended observation before any deterrent action. I sent a copy to the survey authority as my preliminary field note. I did not send a copy to Viral Resources because Viral Resources was the extraction license holder, not my employer, and I had no contractual obligation to keep them informed of preliminary observations. That note, incidentally, is one of the documents that Director Viral's team has described as evidence of my unauthorized concealment of hazard data. I would like the record to reflect that it was a preliminary field note, filed correctly with my actual employer, and that the determination of whether a biological organism constitutes a hazard is not within the competence of an extraction license holder. It is within the competence of the authority. I filed my data with the authority. That is what I was contracted to do. The first time I saw them was on day 11. I was running a routine check on the dive lock chamber, the lower chamber that allows access to the water directly from inside the platform structure. It is accessed by a ladder from the instrument deck, and it sits about 2 meters below the waterline. When the outer hatch is sealed, it is dry. When the outer hatch is open, it fills to about knee depth with seawater. I was checking the hatch seals, which required me to climb down into the chamber and run my hands along the gasket line. The outer hatch was sealed. I was about halfway through the gasket check when I heard it. Not through the hydrophones, through my chest. That is the only way I can describe it. A low, sustained vibration, below the threshold of what I would call a sound, more of a pressure wave, that I felt in my sternum and in the base of my throat. It lasted about 4 seconds and then stopped. I stopped moving. I waited. It came again, slightly different in its rhythm, and this time I thought I could feel it shifting in pitch, very gradually, and then holding. I finished the gasket check. I climbed back up. I went straight to the hydrophone console and pulled up the real-time feed. The pattern was there, strong and close. The amplitude was higher than I had seen in any of the log data from previous rotations, which told me the source was within about 30 to 40 meters of the array. I went back to the dive lock the next morning. I opened the outer hatch. I want to be clear about something. This was not a reckless decision. I had reviewed all available documentation on large pelagic organisms known to inhabit the Corindal Basin. Nothing in that documentation matched the acoustic profile I was observing. I was operating on the reasonable professional judgment that an organism producing complex, directed acoustic communication was not behaving like a predator in ambush mode. Ambush predators do not announce themselves to their intended prey for 11 days in advance. That is not what ambush predators do. I opened the outer hatch because the data suggested it was appropriate to do so, and because I wanted to see what was there. The water in the dive lock came up to my knees. It was cold. The deep shelf water runs about 4 degrees colder than surface temperature, and the platform does not heat the dive lock chamber. I stood at the open outer hatch, and I looked down into the water beneath the platform skirt, and for about 2 minutes I saw nothing. Just dark water and the structural support columns going down into the dark. Then the stripe appeared, a faint cold blue-green luminescence, about 3 meters below the surface, moving slowly from left to right along the line of the platform skirt. It was not a large stripe at first, maybe 1.5 meters of visible length. Then another appeared behind it, then a third, slightly smaller. They moved in formation, the way a school of fish moves in formation, but more deliberate, more controlled. They were not hurrying. They were, I think now, giving me time to look at them. The first stripe, the largest, rose toward the surface. I backed up one step, which was all the room the chamber had, and then I made myself stop backing up and stand still. The stripe came up until I could see the shape of it, a body the size of a large cetacean, but the wrong shape for any cetacean, long and sinuous with 6 articulated fin structures folded flat against the flanks. The skin was matte black. The bioluminescent stripe ran from just below what I would have to call a jaw, a broad, flat-fronted head with a jaw hinge that seemed to run almost the full width of the skull, all the way to a forked tail structure that was half in shadow. The eyes, when they cleared the surface light threshold, were amber, not warm amber, cold amber, the color of very old resin, and they were fixed on my face. I did not move. I want to describe what that moment was actually like, because I think the deposition panel deserves an honest account rather than a sanitized one. I was standing in cold water up to my knees in a chamber approximately 2.5 meters square, on a platform in the middle of a deep shelf sea, 6 hours from the nearest inhabited station, looking at an organisms larger than anything I had ever been in the same space with. The correct response, by any reasonable safety protocol, would have been to close the outer hatch and go back up to the instrument deck. I did not do that. I stood still. I want to be honest about why. It was not bravery, and it was not recklessness. It was that the animal's behavior did not match any threat profile I had ever trained against. Threat approach is fast, direct, and accompanied by a specific physiological cascade in the observer, the kind of adrenal response that makes your field of vision narrow and your hands start to function without waiting for your brain. What I felt in that moment was not that. It was the opposite. It was a quality of attention so complete and so unhurried that it had, if I can put it this way, a gravitational quality. It was not a thing you moved away from. It was a thing you stayed still for. The animal held position at the surface for approximately 30 seconds. Then it produced the vibration, the chest pressure wave, from what I would later determine were resonance organs located in the lateral flanks, behind the gill slits, close range, at a register that was high enough to resolve into something I could almost call a tone. It lasted 6 seconds. I counted. When it stopped, I did the only thing I could think to do. I hummed, a sustained tone in the middle of my vocal range, about 4 seconds. I do not know why I did that. It was an instinct, the kind of thing you do when you want to indicate that you are listening and that you intend to. Keep listening. I have done it in conversations with people who are struggling to explain something difficult. I did it with a 6-meter deep-water predator in a freezing dive-lock chamber, and I am aware that sounds unhinged, but it seemed correct in the moment. The animal was still for another few seconds. Then it produced a response. A brief low pulse, followed by a rising tone, followed by silence. Then it sank back below the platform's skirt line and the stripe faded into the dark. I went back to the hydrophone console and sat down, and I did not move for about 20 minutes. Then I wrote it up in my survey log. Day 11. Direct visual contact with source organism. Single adult female, estimated length 6 to 6.5 meters. Hexapedal fin configuration. Matte black integument with bioluminescent lateral stripe. Amber eyes. Acoustic communication confirmed at close range. Organism responded to human vocalization. Behavior non-aggressive throughout. Recommend continued observation. No deterrent action warranted. I did not tell the survey authority about the humming. That felt like something that did not belong in an official field note. I told them about the rest of it. Her name, and I am using that word deliberately, because by about day 40 I had started thinking of her by a name, which I understand is not standard field practice but which I stand behind, was Sul. I named the largest adult female Sul. The 4 subadults, which I first distinguished from the adult size and by the narrower, less fully developed lateral stripe, I named Ren, Vath, Keth, and Or. Ren was the one who had started surfacing in the dive lock on her own by about week 6. Ren was smaller than the others and quicker to surface, and the way she would hold position at the surface of the dive lock with her flat, broad head just clearing the waterline and her cold amber eyes watching me while I ran my morning instrument checks. There is not a precise, scientific vocabulary for what that was like. I will try to describe it accurately anyway. It was like being evaluated, every morning, with patient and unhurried attention, by something that was significantly older and significantly more competent in the water than I would ever be, and that had decided for reasons I did not fully understand that I was worth evaluating. I started leaving the outer hatch open during my morning checks. By week 8, Ren was in the chamber itself, that is, at the surface inside the chamber, not just at the hatch. during my morning checks, and by week 10 all 4 subadults were doing it. Not at the same time. They seemed to understand, or to have worked out among themselves, that the chamber was only large enough for one of them at the surface at a time. They would rotate. One would surface, hold position for several minutes, produce a short resonance click sequence, and then sink back, and the next would come up. I started responding to each of them individually, varying my response to try to match the register of their opening click. I do not know if that was meaningful to them. I believe it was. I cannot prove that in any quantifiable way. What I could observe and record was that they were distinguishable from one another, not only by size but by the specific character of their click sequences. Ren's openings were quick and high at the front end, dropping in the second pulse. Vath was the opposite, a low sustained tone first, then a sharper pulse at the end. Keth would produce a triple click with nearly equal spacing, and Or, the quietest of the 4, the one least likely to surface close to me, would sometimes surface without vocalizing at all. Just hold at the waterline and watch me with those amber eyes for 2 or 3 minutes before going back down. I documented all of these individual profiles in my survey log. My working hypothesis was that the click sequence variations were individually distinctive, that each animal had a signature pattern, in the same way that individual cetaceans have characteristic vocalizations that allow them to be identified acoustically. I had 17 months of data to test this hypothesis against before the incident occurred. The hypothesis held. I started responding to each of them individually, varying my response to try to match the register of their opening click. What I can quantify is the acoustic data, the directed transmissions to the hydrophone array, which had been occurring since before my arrival, and which had been logged as unexplained anomalies in 2 previous rotations, shifted in character during my first 3 months on the platform. The frequency range narrowed, the complexity increased. The timing of the transmissions began to correlate with my activity patterns on the platform, specifically with my instrument cycles, my dive lock visits, and my periods of active work at the hydrophone console. I ran correlation analyses on this. I still have the data. The correlation coefficient between activity log and the transmission timing was 0.87 across the first 90-day period, which is not a coincidence. That is a pack of large marine predators timing their communications around the schedule of one specific human being on the platform above them. I filed the correlation analysis with the survey authority at the end of my first 90-day period, when I requested the first contract extension. I explained that I believed the Drethkai, which is the name I had given them in my logs, from the old deep-water cartographer's term for the ones that run in the dark, were demonstrating what I called directed associative behavior. They were recognizing me as an individual, tracking my patterns, and orienting their acoustic activity around my presence. I asked for more time to develop the acoustic record. The survey authority granted the extension. I do not know if they understood exactly what I was describing, but they wanted the data, and I was getting data that no previous rotation had gotten, so they extended my contract. I did not hear from Viral Resources until month 5. In the intervening months 2 through 4, the platform fell into a rhythm I found, and I use this word with full awareness of its imprecision, satisfying. I ran my instrument checks. I worked at the console. I ate the adequate but uninspired rations that the survey authority reprovisioned every 60 days by automated supply drone. I slept. I ran the numbers, refined the correlation analyses, built a behavioral taxonomy of the Drethkai's click sequence vocabulary that was by month 4, 12 pages long and cross-referenced against my hydrophone logs. I sent field notes to the survey authority on a 7-day cycle. I received dry acknowledgments in return. I also, during this period, learned something about what extended solitude actually is, as distinct from what people imagine it to be. It is not melancholy. It is not loneliness in the active sense. It is a gradual simplification of attention, a process by which the noise of other people's requirements, expectations, and schedules stops drowning out the signal of the world you are actually in. On platform Hesok, the world I was actually in was a deep shelf sea, an old rig, and a pack of large acoustic predators. That was enough. I found I wanted nothing else from it. I will not pretend that as a state every person would find comfortable, but it suited me. The message came through the standard platform relay, addressed to current platform occupant, and it was from a logistics coordinator at Viral Resources, not from Director Viral himself, not at that stage. It requested that I file a hazard status update on the large biological organisms previously documented near the platform. Structure. The tone of the message was, I will say, businesslike in the way that messages from corporations are businesslike when they have already decided what they want the answer to be and are asking you to confirm it. I replied that the organisms were under active observation and that no hazard determination had been made, and that hazard determinations were in any case within the authority's jurisdiction, not mine. I provided the survey authority as the appropriate point of contact. I received an acknowledgement and nothing further for about 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, Sult came to the surface in the dive lock for the first time. I want to be clear about the timeline here because the incident report filed by Vrl Resources has implied that my observations of Sully in the dive lock were in some way fabricated or exaggerated in my survey logs. They were not. I have time-stamped hydrophone data, time-stamped video from the dive lock maintenance camera, which I had activated because I wanted a visual record of the subadult visits, and my own contemporaneous field notes. The timeline is solid. Sul came to the surface in the dive lock on the morning of day 142 of my time on the platform. I know because I was there. I was doing my morning instrument check, and I heard the water in the chamber behind me change in character. A different displacement sound, a bigger wake, and I turned around, and she was there. I will tell you what she looked like at close range. From the level of the instrument deck, looking down into the dive lock chamber, her head filled most of the chamber surface. The jaw structure, which I had observed before at a distance but not at this proximity, was extraordinary in its engineering. The jaw hinge ran, as I had estimated, nearly the full width of the skull, which meant that when she opened her mouth a very small amount, which she did once while I was watching, the gape was wide enough to be, and I am choosing this word carefully, architectural, not threatening. She was not displaying threat. She held her mouth open for about 2 seconds and then closed it again. And I think now that she was showing me her teeth, the way a person's might show you something they find interesting, not the way a person points a weapon at you. I have thought about that gesture a great deal. Her eyes at close range were the same cold amber, but there was more visible structure to them than I had appreciated from a distance. The iris had radial banding, darker amber at the outer edge, lighter near the pupil, and the pupil itself was not round. It was a horizontal bar, very wide, that narrowed in the chamber's indirect light. She held my gaze for, and I counted, 11 seconds. Then she produced the resonance click sequence from close range, and I felt it in my back teeth. I hummed back. She stayed in the chamber for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Then she sank back out through the outer hatch, and I watched the bioluminescent stripe dinge into the dark below the platform skirt. I went back upstairs and I sat at the console for a long time without working. I was trying to find the correct technical vocabulary for what I had just observed, and I was failing, because the correct technical vocabulary is this. A 6-meter apex predator had come to the surface in an enclosed chamber with a human being, had displayed her jaw, had made extended eye contact, had produced a directed acoustic communication, had waited for a response, had received one, and had departed without any behavior that a trained observer could classify as threatening. That sequence of events, in any documented behavioral context I was aware of, constituted an interaction between two individuals that recognized each other as individuals, not as categories, not as predator and prey or surveyor and subject, as two specific beings who had arrived at a specific arrangement through 18 months of patient incremental exchange. I'm a survey technician. I deal in data. I try to be precise in my language and honest in my findings, and I try not to extrapolate beyond what the data supports. The data supported what I wrote in my field note. Behavioral patterns consistent with individual recognition and voluntary affiliation. That is the technical vocabulary. It is accurate. It is also, I think, inadequate to what it was actually like to have Sul's amber eyes 6 inches from my face in a cold dive-lock chamber on a deep shelf platform in the middle of an empty sea. I wrote it up anyway. It was what I had. Sul came back 7 times in the following 2 months. The subadults continued their rotation visits, and I noticed that when Sul came up, the subadults would surface in the water just outside the outer hatch, but not enter the chamber, as if they were waiting, as if they understood that the chamber was a specific place for a specific kind of interaction, and that they were not the principals of it. I do not know if that interpretation is correct. I recorded it as a behavioral observation. Month 7, the second message from Vrl Resources arrived. This one was from Director Vrl himself. It was not businesslike in the way the first one had been businesslike. It was direct. He wrote that Viral Resources held the active extraction license for the Hesok Formation seabed mineral rights, that the presence of large biological organisms in and around platform Hesok constituted a documented hazard to extraction operations, that 2 previous rotation teams had confirmed this in their departure reports, and that he was formally requesting that I file a hazard confirmation, so that Viral Resources could proceed with a licensed hazard removal operation. Under Compact Deep Water Code, Section 44, Subsection 7, I read it 3 times, then I wrote back. I told Director Viral that I had no hazard determination to file, because no hazard had been observed. I told him that the organisms I had been observing for 7 months were demonstrating complex directed acoustic communication, individual recognition behavior, and non-aggressive orientation toward the platform and its occupant. I told him that filing a false hazard determination would be a violation of my certification terms and of the Compact Deep Water Survey Charter, neither of which I was willing to violate. I told him that if Viral Resources had concerns about the Drethkai's impact on their extraction operations, the appropriate process was to apply to the authority for a formal habitat assessment, which would take approximately 18 months to complete, and in the meantime no extraction or hazard removal operations could proceed under Code Section 44, Subsection 7, without the hazard determination that I had just declined to provide. I sent a copy to the Survey Authority. The Survey Authority sent me a very dry acknowledgement note 3 days later, confirming receipt, and I had the distinct impression from its tone that whoever drafted it was trying not to express anything that could be interpreted as approval. Month 8, the subadults started following me. Not in the water. I should be clear that I was not in the water, and I had no intention of entering the water, because I am a survey technician, not a diver. Because, however confident I was in my assessment of the Drethkai's non-aggressive orientation, I did not think that extending that confidence to being in open water with them was a reasonable next step. What I mean is that the subadults started tracking my movements along the platform structure from below. I would walk from the instrument deck to the upper observation rail, and I would look down at the water line, and one of them, usually Wren, but sometimes Vath, would be tracking along below, matching my pace, their lateral stripe visible just at the surface. I would stop, they would stop. I would reverse direction, they would reverse. I started testing this deliberately, reversing suddenly, moving fast, stopping short. They were not struggling to keep up. They were choosing to match my pace, which was something different. I wrote this up as spatial mirroring behavior. Subadults demonstrating voluntary coordination with technician movement patterns at the platform. Surface interface. I sent it to the Survey Authority. I received another dry acknowledgement. I have since wondered if the person writing those acknowledgements was reading my reports with any degree of attention, and I believe they were, because of a conversation I had in month 9 with the Survey Authority's regional director, who called me on the platform relay and spent about 20 minutes asking me technical questions about the acoustic data that would not have made sense unless he had read all of my reports in some detail. He did not mention Viral Resources by name during that call, but he asked me, near the end of it, whether I thought the Drethkai demonstrated what he called persistent territorial association with the platform structure. I told him I thought they demonstrated persistent territorial association with a specific individual on the platform structure, which was somewhat different, and that I could provide the correlation analysis to support that if he wanted it. He said he would appreciate that. I sent it. Nothing happened for 3 months, in the sense that nothing happened with the Survey Authority or with Viral Resources. Things kept happening on the platform. Zul's visits to the dive lock became more regular, approximately once every 11 days, which I suspect was the natural rhythm of something in her migration or feeding pattern that brought her close to the platform on that cycle. The subadult's behavioral repertoire expanded in ways I found hard to document precisely, but that I will try to describe. They started producing click sequences toward me that were distinct from the standard resonance clicks. Shorter, sharper, with a specific 2-pulse structure that I came to associate, through repeated observation, with alerting behavior. When a transit vessel crossed the Hesok corridor, even vessels too distant to see from the platform, the subadults would produce the 2-pulse, alert and surface along the platform skirt in a specific pattern spread out, facing outward, not toward me, away from the platform, toward the direction of the approaching vessel. After that task, they would return to their normal distribution. I noted this in my logs. Subadults demonstrating perimeter orientation behavior in response to external approach events. Alert vocalization precedes human detection of same by approximately 4 to 7 minutes. Behavior consistent with pack territorial monitoring. In month 11, I extended my contract for the third time. By that point, I had not had another human on the platform for 9 months. The survey authority had not sent a maintenance crew, the platform systems were stable, and there was no pressing need for one. And I was, to be direct about it, fine with that. I had the acoustic data, I had the behavioral record, and I had a routine that worked. I woke up, I ran my instrument checks, I went to the dive lock, I worked at the console, I ate, I slept. The Drethkai were part of that routine in the way that the platform's structural sounds were part of it. A consistent presence that I had learned, the vocabulary of, and that I would have noticed the absence of with some sharpness. I will not pretend that this is a purely professional observation. It is also a personal one. 18 months is a long time to be the only person on a platform in the middle of a cold sea. And the Drethkai were company in a sense that I think the authority deposition panel will understand even if they do not want to put it in the official record. They were present. They were paying attention. When I was working late at the console, there would be a click sequence from below. Not the Alert 2 pulse, something else, something slower and more even. And I had no scientific basis for what I thought it was, but I always heard it as the acoustic equivalent of a light in a window. Someone knowing where you are and being unchanged by it. I am aware that this sounds like something other than survey data. I am including it because you asked for a full account, and a full account includes what it was actually like. Month 14, the communication from Viral Resources changed in character again. I received notice, copied to the survey authority, that Director Viral had applied for an emergency hazard removal authorization under a different subsection of the code, one that did not require a survey technician's hazard determination, but instead required only documentation of operational interference licensed extraction activities. The documentation Viral Resources had filed was the 2 departure reports from the previous rotations, which noted the presence of the Drethkai and the refusal of 2 team members to conduct dive lock maintenance. They argued that this constituted documented interference. I sent a response to the authority pointing out that the departure reports predated my survey period and that my 18 months of subsequent observation constituted a more current and more comprehensive record. I also pointed out that the departure reports documented no actual harm to personnel or equipment, only the presence of organisms and the subjective discomfort of 2 team members. I included my full behavioral dataset as supporting documentation. The authorities sent a response, somewhat less dry than previous ones, informing me that the emergency hazard removal application was under review and that no action could proceed during the review period. They also informed me that the review period was 30 days. I noted this and I thought about what 30 days meant. 30 days was, as I calculated it, approximately 1 cycle before Sewell's next visit to the dive lock. I went down to the dive lock that evening, and I opened the outer hatch, and I stood in the cold water up to my knees in the dark, and I waited. The stripe appeared after about 15 minutes. Not Sewell, but Wren, smaller and quicker than any of the adults. Wren surfaced in the chamber and held position, and I produced the slow, even click sequence, not the alert, the other one, and held it for about 10 seconds. Wren watched me. Then she produced a response I had not heard before, a long, complex, rising sequence that ended in a tone I felt in my jaw. I do not know what it meant. I wrote it down as precisely as I could. I also, that evening, wrote a detailed message to the Survey Authority's regional director. Not a field note, a letter, as direct as I could make it. I told him that I believed the Drethkai pack had been using platform Hesok as a territorial anchor point for what I estimated to be several generations based on the acoustic record's evident familiarity with the platform structure. I told him that the pack had demonstrated, over 18 months of documented observation, individual recognition of a human occupant, complex communicative behavior, and territorial coordination behavior that in any land-based context would be legally recognizable as established habitation. I told him that the emergency hazard removal application, if approved, would result in the irreversible disruption of a documented and potentially unique behavioral system. And I told him that if the authority wanted me to appear before whatever review panel was handling the application, I would make myself available. He responded within 6 hours, which was faster than anything I had received from him previously. He said the review panel would want my full behavioral dataset, and that he would personally ensure it was included in the review package. He also said at the end of the message, and I quote this exactly because I found it clarifying, "I have been reading your field notes for 14 months. I think you should know that they are unlike any acoustic survey notes I have read in 22 years in this office. Please keep writing them." I did not know what to do with that. I wrote back and said thank you. The review period ended. The emergency hazard removal application was denied. The authorities' denial cited, among other things, my behavioral dataset, the acoustic correlation analysis, and a finding that the previous departure reports did not, in fact, constitute documented operational interference under the applicable code subsection because interference requires actual disruption of operational activity, and Viral Resources had not at any point commenced actual extraction operations. I was informed of the denial on a Tuesday. On Thursday, I received notification that Director Viral had filed an appeal. The appeal would take another 30 days to process. On the following Monday, the salvage vessel arrived at the Hessock corridor boundary. I saw it on the platform's navigation display at 7 in the morning, standard time. A licensed deep-water operations vessel, flag registry confirmed as Viral Resources subsidiary. It was not moving yet. It was holding position at the boundary, which I took to mean they were waiting for the appeal to resolve, or they were waiting for something else. I was not sure which. I called the survey authority's emergency relay line and reported the vessel's presence and its registry. The duty officer confirmed receipt and told me that no authorized hazard removal operation was currently permitted, and that the appeal was still in process. I asked him to note the vessel's position in the incident log. He did. The vessel did not move for 4 days. During those 4 days, the Drethkai's behavior changed. The subadults stopped their rotation visits to the dive lock. The click sequences from below shifted, more frequent, shorter, with the 2-pulse alert pattern appearing at intervals where there was nothing visible on the platform's detection instruments to warrant it. Sul's stripe appeared at the platform skirt more often than her usual cycle, circling in a pattern I had not seen before. Not agitated. I want to be precise about this. It was not a behavior that I read as panic or stress. It was a behavior I read as preparation. The pack was adjusting its spatial distribution around the platform, pulling in. I watched this and I made notes. On the 5th day, the salvage vessel moved. It crossed the corridor boundary at approximately 10:40, and I immediately called the survey authority relay again. The duty officer told me, with what I thought was genuine discomfort, that the appeal process created an ambiguous legal window during which he was not certain the vessel's entry to the corridor was a clear code violation. He said escalate. I told him to please escalate quickly, because the vessel was an 800-ton deep-water operations platform, and it was moving toward the Hessock Formation at approximately 14 knots, and I was alone on the survey platform, and I would appreciate if the authorities' response arrived before the vessel did. There was a brief pause. Then he said that an authority inspection vessel was currently in the Corndall Basin and could be at platform Hessock in approximately 4 hours. I said 4 hours was fine. I said please send it. Then I went to the dive lock. I opened the outer hatch, and I stood in the water and I waited. And within about 3 minutes, I had all 4 subadults at the surface in the water, just outside the hatch, Ren, Vath, Keth, or, in a line, facing outward, away from the platform, in the direction of the approaching vessel. They were not looking at me. They were facing the vessel. Their lateral stripes were not the soft bioluminescent blue-green I was used to from the routine visits. They were brighter, a colder light, more blue than green, with a sharper edge to the stripe rather than the diffuse glow I associated with their resting state. I noted this. Brighter and colder meant something. I did not know exactly what it meant, but I had read enough of their behavioral signal vocabulary over 18 months to know that it was not a casual state. Sul appeared at the outer hatch about 2 minutes after the subadults. She did not surface into the chamber. She held position just outside the hatch, her stripe running bright, her flat, broad head about half a meter below the surface, and she looked at me with the cold amber eyes. I held her gaze for as long as I could manage, which was about 8 seconds, and then I produced the slow, even click sequence, the one I associated with the light in a window meaning, and I held it for 10 seconds. She stayed outside the hatch for about 20 minutes. Then she went down. The salvage vessel arrived at the platform at approximately 1400 hours. There were 6 crew on the operations vessel, and a 4-person hazard removal team embarked on a licensed deep-water submersible that the vessel deployed about a kilometer out from the platform. I watched the submersible approach on the navigation display. I also watched the Drethkai. What I observed in the next 40 minutes I am going to describe as carefully and as precisely as I can, because it is the part of this account that I expect will receive the most scrutiny, and I want the record to be accurate. The submersible arrived at the platform skirt at approximately 1440. The hazard removal team's published mandate, which I obtained later from the authorities' incident file, was to conduct a deterrent sweep of the platform's immediate vicinity, an initial pass with acoustic deterrent devices, followed by a second pass with depth charges if the acoustic deterrents were unsuccessful. This was their authorized procedure under the code section they had cited in their appeal documentation. They deployed the acoustic deterrent device at 1442. I will not describe the sound the acoustic deterrent made in any detail, because it is not a sound I want to remember with precision. What I will say is that it was designed for deterrence, a high-intensity acoustic pulse meant to be aversive to large marine organisms. I felt it in the platform structure. I also felt it in my chest, in a way that I think was different from the platform vibration, and was instead the Drethkai responding to the deterrent pulse with their own resonance organs at high output. The subadults were no longer at the platform skirt. Sule was no longer at the platform skirt. For about 30 seconds, there was nothing visible in the water around the platform. The salvage vessel crew, who had been watching from the operations deck, were apparently reporting this to the submersible as a positive result, because I could see their body language shift in a way that looked like satisfaction. Then the submersible's forward camera, which was transmitting to a screen on the operations deck, and which I could see from my position on the upper instrument deck, showed what was directly ahead of the submersible. Sule was directly ahead of the submersible, not behind it, not below it. Directly ahead facing the submersible, holding position at depth, with her lateral stripe running the cold blue light at full intensity. She was larger than the submersible. The submersible was a 4-person deep-water vehicle rated to 400 meters, approximately 9 meters in length, and she was larger than it. Not by a small margin, by a meaningful margin. She was facing it the way you face something you have decided to deal with, and she was not moving. The submersible attempted to alter course. It banked right, Sule banked right, it banked left. She banked left, matching. Not chasing, she was not chasing the submersible. She was staying in front of it. She was, as precisely as I can put it, not permitting it to advance. I watched the salvage vessel crew. They had stopped moving on the operations deck. One of them had a radio handset to his ear. I could not hear what was being said, but the quality of his stillness told me he was not receiving good news. The submersible halted. Sule moved to it. What she did next took approximately 8 seconds, and it did not damage the submersible. I want to be clear about that, because the incident report filed by the salvage vessel's captain describes this as an aggressive attack on the vessel, and I dispute that characterization. An aggressive attack is what happens when a 6-meter deep-water predator uses its full jaw gape and the musculature behind it on a 9-meter submersible. What Sule did was take the forward sensor housing, the projecting nose section of the submersible, in her jaw with the jaw about 40% open, and she held it. She did not bite down. She did not crush. She held the submersible nose down and angled it approximately 30 degrees below horizontal, and she held it there, stationary, at depth. The submersible's drive motors were running. I could see the prop wash in the camera feed. The submersible was applying thrust. Sule was ignoring the thrust. She held it for what my deposition notes indicate was 4 minutes and 17 seconds. And during those 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the 4 subadults surfaced around the salvage vessel's hull. Not attacking, present. Circling at the surface, in a pattern I can only describe as a containment formation. One at the bow, one at the stern, one to port, one to starboard, at a distance of about 10 meters from the hull, moving in slow coordinated passes, their stripes at full cold blue intensity. The salvage vessel crew were on the upper deck watching them. I was on the upper instrument deck, watching the salvage vessel crew watch them. There were 6 crew members. I watched all 6 of them, and I want to describe what I saw, because I think it is the most important part of what I observed in that 40-minute period. They were afraid, not panicked. They were professionals, and they were maintaining composure, but they were afraid in a measured and specific way, that I recognized as the appropriate response to a situation they had not been prepared for. They had been told they were going to do a deterrent sweep. They had been told the organisms would respond to the acoustic pulse and withdraw. They had not been told that the organisms would fail to withdraw, and that the alpha would then go directly to their submersible and hold it at 30 degrees nose down in 40 meters of water, while the juveniles took containment positions around the hull. None of them got in the water. I want to note that. Because there were emergency dive suits in the operations deck locker, I had seen the crew retrieve equipment from it earlier, and none of the 6 crew members put on a dive suit and entered the water to attempt a direct intervention. I think that was a correct decision. I think they understood, in the moment, that going into the water was not something they should do. Sewell held the submersible for another 12 minutes, and then she released it. She did not withdraw. She maintained position ahead of the submersible as it recovered to a stable attitude, and then retreated back toward the parent vessel. She followed it to the vessel's deployment bay, and then held at 10 meters from the hull while the crew recovered the submersible. Then she went down, and the cold blue of her stripe diminished until it was gone. The subadults stayed at their containment positions around the vessel hull. The Authority inspection vessel arrived at the Hesok corridor at 1500 hours, which was approximately 17 minutes after Sully released the submersible. It was a Class 2 inspection vessel with a 4-person inspection team and an Authority enforcement officer. I spoke to the enforcement officer by relay as they approached, and I gave him a precise account of what had occurred, including my time-stamped navigation display records, which I had been logging throughout. The Authority inspection team boarded the Salvage vessel at approximately 15:30. The subadults maintained their containment positions during the boarding. I observed this from the upper instrument deck. The subadults did not withdraw from the vessel hull until the Authority inspection vessel's navigation lights indicated that it had assumed a positional lock alongside the Salvage vessel, that is, until the Authority vessel was, for practical purposes, keeping station with the Salvage vessel in a way that made the Salvage vessel's movement contingent on the Authority vessel's agreement. When the Authority vessel took that position, Wren surfaced at the dive lock. She had not been at the dive lock since the submersible's approach, and she produced a short, single pulse click. Then she went down, and then all 4 subadults withdrew from the containment formation around the Salvage vessel hull and disappeared below the platform's skirt. I have thought about that sequence of events a great deal since it occurred. I do not have a scientific explanation for how Wren or any of the subadults determined that the Authority vessel's positional lock on the Salvage vessel constituted adequate resolution of the situation. I observed it. I recorded it. I do not think I need to explain it. The Salvage vessel departed the Hesok corridor the following morning. The Authority inspection team remained on platform Hesok for 3 days, during which time they reviewed my complete behavioral dataset and took depositions from me and from the Salvage vessel captain. I am told the captain's deposition was brief. I am told it contained very little that disputed my account of events, which I do not find surprising. Director Verl's appeal was ruled invalid on procedural grounds 13 days after the incident. The ruling found that the Salvage vessel had crossed the corridor boundary during an active appeal period, which constituted a code violation independent of the underlying hazard dispute. Verl Resources' extraction license for the Hesok formation was suspended pending a full habitat assessment, which will take, as I mentioned in my correspondence, approximately 18 months. During the suspension, no extraction or hazard removal operations are permitted. The Authority's regional director contacted me 8 days after the incident to inform me that my survey contract had been extended for another 18 months, coterminous with the habitat assessment period. He said the extension was contingent on my continued behavioral documentation of the Drethkai pack. I said that was agreeable to me. He also said, and I will end this deposition with this, because it seems like the right note to end on. He said that the Authority's Deep Water Behavioral Assessment Panel had reviewed my 18 months of field notes and acoustic data, and that their preliminary finding was that the Drethkai pack demonstrated what the panel was calling extended territorial affiliation with a specific individual, which was a designation that, to his knowledge, had not previously been applied to a deep water species. I asked him what that designation meant in practical terms. He said it meant that Compact Deep Water Provisions Article 17 applied. The pack's established territorial behavior was legally recognizable. Their territorial anchor point, Platform Hesok, was protected, and any person or entity seeking to disrupt that territory needed to demonstrate to the authority that the disruption was both necessary and could be conducted without harm to the affiliated individual. The affiliated individual, in this case, being me. I asked him if that meant Director Verl would need my agreement before any future extraction operation could proceed. There was a pause, then he said, "Effectively, yes." I said I appreciated that. Then I went down to the dive lock, and I opened the outer hatch, and I stood in the cold water up to my knees. And after about 10 minutes the stripe appeared below the surface, Sul on schedule, her lateral line running the soft resting blue-green I knew from the morning visits. And she rose to the surface in the chamber, and I looked at her and she looked at me, and I produced the slow even click sequence, 10 seconds, and she answered it, the same way she had been answering it for 18 months. I want the record to note that I am not under any illusions about what Suli is. She is a 6-meter deep water pack predator. She has a jaw that could, if she chose to use it that way, do to me what she did to the submersible's sensor housing in approximately 1/5 of the time. She has a pack of 4 subadults who can maintain a containment formation around an 800-ton vessel for 17 minutes without instruction from anyone I could observe giving them instructions. She is not tame. She is not safe in the ways that something domesticated is safe. She is something that has looked at me for 18 months and decided, for reasons I can document in approximately 400 pages of acoustic survey data but cannot fully explain, that I am worth the patience. I think that is worth more than safe. I have nothing further to add to this deposition. Thank you for your time.